What about a girl?
I was camping with my husband and his family at a small remote lake in New Mexico. There were about 10 people in our group and another group of 6 people in the next campsite. It was nighttime and both groups were doing typical activities, making s'mores, having a few drinks and telling stories, when we all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling out for help. Neither group had children with them, but we were all positive we were hearing a little girl and decided to search the area. There was a field behind our campsites, and we all saw a very tall, pure white figure standing maybe 100 feet away from us in the field, making the noises. We all agreed this thing looked maybe 6 feet tall, skinny, and white as can be. We made our way closer to investigate, but whatever it was that we saw started backing off as we got closer, and it disappeared into the trees. We returned to our campsite, and all night we continued to hear a little girl calling for help as we tried to sleep. The unrest stopped. I was driving across country with my mom and sister when I was 16 and my sister was 20. It was late, but we were all well rested and alert. We were driving along an interstate and needed gas and a bathroom break, so we stopped at the only rest stop in 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on a road trip at the gas station, as well as a small gray car parked at the pump in front of us, with 2 young men standing still outside of it. When we got there, everything felt wrong. We'd been on the road for days and seen many rest stops at night, and had never been afraid until then. My mom and sister went inside and I stayed in the car. I heard a teenager say they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work, and they left in a hurry. I was watching the car in front of us, and the 2 men had not moved at all, not an inch. They weren't talking, there weren't any phones, they were just standing there, still as a rock. My sister and mom came running back out to the car, and when they got in, the 2 men slowly turned to look at us, while not moving or pivoting the rest of their bodies. And I swear, we all saw the same thing. They had eyes dark as pitch black and empty, truly empty, not reflecting any light at all, just a void. We sped out of there and didn't stop until we were in the next city. The worst thing about the entire experience, we couldn't find the place on any map. We knew exactly which spot on the interstate to look, and we couldn't find it on Google Maps or any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station out on a stretch of road and only got confused looks. We traveled on that interstate since, and there's no rest stop.
It was good to see an old friend.
When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of town, I see someone on the side of the road, flagging me down. It turned out that it was one of the guys I had attended school with. He gets in the car and we start talking. Jim. I had not seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same. Maybe a little older, but pretty much the same. So anyway, we get to town and I ask him if he wants to come to the event and have a few drinks. He says, "Nah, just take me home." I thought, okay, no problem. Jim's parents had lived only a few blocks from my grandmother's house, and I turned in that direction, but he said to take him to the outskirts of town. There was a mobile home park out there, and I figured, that is where he lived. When we reached the end of the turnoff, he said, "Just drop me here. Hey man, it was good to see you again." And he walks off into the night. So I go to the high school reunion, met some of my old classmates. We start to talk and, catch up. As we were talking about who's coming to the reunion, I mentioned that I had just picked up Jim about 3 miles east of town and had dropped him off. Everyone gets quiet. Even the guy singing karaoke stops and lays down the mic. My cousin's face turns white as snow. "Hey, Jim died on that curve 8 years ago, man. It was a very violent accident. His car rolled and he was pretty much crushed to death. And we all attended his funeral." started to feel real dizzy, and I ran out to the car to take some deep breaths. There, on the seat, is a local newspaper, printed 8 years previous, containing Jim's obituary. I still have the paper.
Death came for him.
I was standing in my parents' room talking to my very sick dad at the time. He was dying of stage 4 esophageal cancer. I got the weird feeling that something was behind me. I looked towards the doorway to the living room, and something about 4'6" in height and fully black is peeking around the corner with its hands on the door frame. So, frightened but curious, I ran towards it. When I got outside the doorway, there was nothing. My dad was completely confused when I stepped back inside the room when I tell him people who stayed at my house in my dad's final days claimed to have seen it. My mom saw the figure on multiple occasions, in multiple places, until he passed away. We haven't seen it since.
If you enjoyed the stories, please hit the like button.
Elsa, a character from the Disney movie Frozen, was a familiar face. That's probably an understatement. See, Frozen was a movie that was once amongst the top 5 highest grossing film of all time. Disney produced millions of merchandise such as t-shirts, bags, watches, bicycles, shoes, dolls, you name it. So as a Christmas gift, a lady bought a doll of Elsa for her great-granddaughter, the daughter of Emily and Matt Madonia. So for a few years, the doll was adored, loved, as expected from a 1-year-old. What little girl wouldn't adore a Disney character, right? Usually when a talking or singing toy starts to malfunction from wear and tear, the kids may grow out of it, or the family may place it somewhere in the storage or even discard it. Well, Emily and Matt, the parents of this little girl, had other reasons to let it go. The doll recited phrases from the movie Frozen and sang the song Let It Go when a button on its necklace was pressed. And for 2 years, it did that in English. The mother, Emily Madonia, said, in 2015, it started doing it in alternating between Spanish and English. It just randomly did it. The family has owned the doll for more than 6 years and never changed its batteries. The mother said the doll would randomly begin to speak and sing even when its switch was turned off. Eventually, the doll was thrown out in December 2019. A few weeks later, the family found Elsa on a bench in the living room. Everyone was spooked and started to think it may have been a prank. The kids insisted they didn't put it there, and I believed them because they wouldn't have dug through the garbage outside, Emily said. Elsa sang the song Let It Go in Spanish when a button was pressed, only in that language. Elsa was double bagged and shoved in the bottom of a trash can, which was taken on garbage day. Putting that weird situation behind them and probably brushing it off as a mistake, they decided to go on a trip, a nice little getaway. After they returned from their trip, the daughter went to play in the backyard and made a chilling discovery. Elsa welcomed them back home. Emily and Matt decided to mail the creepy doll to a family friend in Minnesota. Elsa was caged, then taped to a front bumper of their Jeep. According to Emily, the doll hasn't made its way back to the house. Yet. Here's a creepy story by a Reddit user by the name of Sin Aesthetis. I woke up. Clock says 3:34 a.m. I'm 17 and I'm in my bedroom. It's pitch black, but I hear some rattling downstairs. Terrified, I quietly tiptoe to my parents' room. Weird. It's empty. Where are my parents at 3:34 a.m.? I go upstairs to my brother's room. He's usually awake all night, but while the light is on, no one's in the room. So I guess whatever those noises are downstairs, it must be them. Why are they awake? Maybe someone died? I go go downstairs in the middle of my living room is what looks like two men stealing our TV. No one else is in sight. So I run back upstairs as quietly as possible, shut and lock my door. And suddenly there's banging on my door. I wake up. It was a dream, and the relief washes over me. I look over at my clock. Weird coincidence. It's 3:34 a.m. I'm shaking, but I decide to go downstairs to prove to myself that everything's fine. So I go downstairs. The two men are in my kitchen, screaming at my parents and brother. So I run back upstairs to my bedroom and lock the door. 10 seconds later, I hear banging. I wake up. It's 3:34 a.m. This time, I had actually woken up, and I don't manage to fall back asleep for about 36 hours. This is a story from a deleted Reddit user. A few years ago, I was walking through the woods, and I smelled this really overpowering smell. Now, being nosy, I pulled back the undergrowth to have a look, and I found a dead body. The guy had clearly been there for a while, and wasn't looking great. All swollen and green and black with various running bits. I can tell the local wildlife had also been dining for a few days. I called the police, who told me to wait with the body until they arrive. Being in the middle of nowhere, it took a while for them to arrive, and it got dark, and I just sat there with the dead body for a pretty long time. It turned out that he ended his own life. Now, although that's a very disturbing story, what's creepier is, for a long time afterwards, I had dreams. I had reoccurring dreams about him. And he would talk to me, and he wasn't saying nice things. Mainly about how he was angry I had disturbed his resting place, and he wanted me to end myself. Probably just my imagination, but all pretty disturbing at the time. Well, he still turns up in my dreams. And no doubt he will be in my dreams tonight after typing this. Here's a story from another deleted Reddit user. About 2 years ago, I was driving home from a family reunion pretty late at night. And the drive was about 2 hours, so I didn't stay the night because I had to be back for work the following day. Now, most of the drive was on roads with dense bushes and trees on either side, the real creepy ones you see a lot in horror movies. Anyway, I had been driving about 45 minutes, and I was starting to get really tired. You know how sometimes you just suddenly become really tired out of nowhere? Well, yeah, that happened to me. I knew I wasn't going to last, but I didn't come across any place that I felt I could park and safely sleep, so I kept driving. Anyway, after it became clear to me that I wasn't going to find a place to pull up, and my tiredness wasn't going away, I did something very questionable. I pulled over to the side of the road, onto the grass, behind some bushes, to try and hide my car from anybody else who was gonna pass me, and mind you, the roads were not empty. I came across another car every few minutes or so. I made a mental note that the time was 11:22 p.m. and then fell asleep. Sometime later, I was awoken by a scratching sound. I looked at the clock, 11:50 p.m. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and because I was extremely tired, I didn't bother looking around and I just simply went back to sleep. I was later awoken by the same sound, and it was now 12:40. This time, it really freaked me out because the sound didn't stop. The thought ran across my mind that it was just an animal inspecting the car, but why would it return almost an hour after it had left the previous time? I looked in my rearview mirror, and just managed to catch a glimpse of something running away into the forest. Now, at the time, I thought it was the damn hook killer. You know, the one that scratched the couple's car, then slaughtered the guy when he got out to investigate? F that, I thought to myself. So I got the hell out of there. There was a bend no more than 100 yards up the road, and as I came around it, there was a freaking car parked off to the side of the road with the driver's side door opened. I slowed down just to look to see if anyone was in there, and there wasn't. Then I looked in my rearview mirror. I didn't see anything. Then all of a sudden, this guy comes sprinting around the corner. He starts screaming at me, shouting stuff like, "Hey, you! Get the out of your car, now!" I hit the gas and sped off. I never saw the guy again. The moral of the story? Don't sleep on the side of a deserted road. It may cost you your life. Be safe. A gentleman by the name of David Allen Kerwin, his close friend Ronald Ratliff, and his friend's dog Moosey took a nice afternoon drive through an area of Yellowstone's National Park. Yellowstone National Park contains all types of thermal features: hot springs, geysers, mud pots, travertine terraces, and fumaroles. The temperatures may vary but can reach around 189 degrees, but definitely could get hotter. Around 1 p.m., David, Ronald, and Ronald's dogs Moosey drove up and parked as close as they could to one of the hot springs. I guess they wanted to, spend some time just walking around, looking at the cool bubbling mud pots and steamy hot springs. When David and Ronald opened the door, Moosey jumped out and escaped. Now, Moosey, I assume, was just an excited dog enjoying the breeze on that car ride, and once it saw an opportunity to get free and jump into the pool of water, it did. The only problem, it was the Celestine pool, and on that particular day, the temperatures for the Celestine pool reached up to 202 degrees Fahrenheit. As soon as the dog jumped in, it began crying for help and yelping and trying to find a way to get out. While it was yelping and desperately trying to swim out the water, David and Ronald immediately tried to save poor Moosey. David was preparing himself to jump in, but the bystanders were yelling at David to not jump in the pool. According to one source, David replied, "Like hell I won't," then proceeded to jump in the piping hot water. David tried his best to grab the dog, but was unsuccessful. He swam back as fast as he could to finally be assisted by his friend Ronald. Ronald and some bystanders helped David out of the hot spring. Ronald suffered second-degree burns on his feet just by helping David out the water. When David was pulled out the hot spring, he muttered, "That was stupid. How bad are my injuries? That was a stupid thing I did." Reportedly, he was blind in both eyes, and when the man that was assisting on aiding David tried removing David's shoes, his entire skin slipped out from his feet. To give you some perspective on the severities of a third-degree burn, a third-degree burn is a burn in which the damage has progressed to the point of skin death. The skin is white and without sensation. In extreme cases, damage may extend beyond the skin and into underlying tissue. In these cases, the skin may be blackened or burned away. Some of you may think, well, can't they perform skin graft surgery? Well, I'm pretty sure it's a whole lot more complicated than we may believe, but I guess that would be a possibility. But the major problem is 100% of his body suffered third-degree burns. So there's no skin to relocate. His entire skin was completely burned off. A day later, David was succumbed to his horrible injuries. Both Musi and David did not make it. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Disturbed is the word. Polar bears are the largest bear species and the biggest land carnivores in the world. The heaviest polar bear recorded was 2,209 pounds. They can reach up to 10 feet or above. As you can see, if you come face to face with this beast barehanded, your survival rate is somewhere between 0 to negative 900%. Now, in case you've lost your mind and want to get a closer look at them, they are located in places like Alaska, Russia, and Greenland. Another place they are heavily located that piqued my interest, Svalbard, Norway. Not only because it's home to 3,000 people and nearly 1,000 polar bears, the culture, their activities.
Welcome to the northernmost hub in the world. You're here. That is funny. Well, we can't say that we haven't seen a polar bear.
It's as if everything is fine. One of the world's northernmost inhabited areas. This island just seems so tranquil, serene. The northern lights are visible during winter, but during the summer, you get sunlight 24 hours a day.
And the staff have to go home. After all, this is 1:30 in the morning.
What they call the midnight sun. What I call a beautiful nightmare.
The plethora of polar bears that were found inside in the airport lounge.
On this island, there are many warning signs cautioning campers of polar bears, even some signs suggesting to carry firearms. One camper, a Dutchman by the name of Johan Jacobus Koot, was a seasonal worker on the island, dealing with tough times during the height of the COVID pandemic. He'd returned to Svalbard to run the campsite. The site was occupied by a few people living in their tents to enjoy the beauty of the Arctic wonderland. At around 3:45 a.m., while the guests were sleeping, a polar bear wandered into the area looking for something to eat. Though there isn't any clear information on the matter, one would assume there might have been food inside their tents, and if that is the case, the bear could have possibly picked up on the scent, which led him right into the campsite. Sticking its head into the unlucky camper's tent, Johan was awoken by a vicious attack and dragged out. His screams would awaken his fellow neighbors, prompting emergency calls. At 3:50 a.m., authorities were alerted and arrived shortly after to find Johan still breathing but suffering from devastating injuries. Despite their efforts to aid him, he sadly passed away. The 6 other campers weren't injured but were still admitted to the hospital and received counseling. The survivors said their thoughts are with the victim's family. The locals shot the polar bear and it was found dead in a parking lot near an airport. These are the photos of his tent he was dragged out of while sleeping. Stefan Lenars. He was my dear friend. He was the sweetest, kindest person you could ever meet. Gunnar Hellas, a guest at the campsite, said, he was one of the people impossible to dislike. He was the type of person who did everything he could to make those around him have a good time, and he had a warm and good personality. Since 1971, Johan was the 5th person to die from a polar bear attack. In 2011, a British student by the name of Horatio Chappell.
Injured but alive. 4 young British men arrived by helicopter at hospital in Longyearbyen after their encounter with the polar bear that killed one of their peers at this remote camp.
4 others were seriously injured but survived in that tragic incident. Horatio Chappell, just 17 years old, was mauled to death by a polar bear. The only advice I can think of to offer is to stay away from the polar bear infested island, but if you must go because you love to travel, make sure you are armed and trained. Outside of the settlements, you are obliged by law to arm yourself as a means to defend or at least scare away the wild animals to prevent a gruesome ending to your life. Be safe. A paper mill factory worker was feeding paper into the rollers when he got pulled in. That accident led to him playing tug-of-war with his arms. An industrial machine, stretching his body and pretty much turning this poor victim into a pretzel. A Michigan man was doing his job at a seamless tube and pipe warehouse, was testing the chemicals in a vat of acid. He slipped and fell and endured the worst pain imaginable. 3 stories, 3 men, 3 terrifying work accidents. A paper mill factory worker in China was beside a paper mill machine making changes to the settings on a monitor, I assume, and starts feeding what seems to be paper into the spinning spool. Even though the quality of the footage isn't high def, it is clear enough to see this employee had faced a horrific accident. 1 second, he is observing the section of the rollers where he inserted the paper, and next thing you know, he is seen pulling and fighting to get his arm out of the machine, but was unsuccessful. Eventually, the machine pulled his entire body in, mangling him, twisting and breaking his legs in different places. After a few rolls, the machine eventually slows down and comes to a stop. A coworker can be seen running to the victim, and the video cuts off. Now, what happened after wasn't really reported, but through my research, I believe this poor victim actually survived this horrible accident. I won't show the injuries of the victim, but the graphic video is floating online. If you want to go see it, do it on your own volition. But I warn you, it is pretty graphic. Viewer discretion is advised. In January 2013, a man who remained unidentified was working at a snack factory in northeast China. While working, he was somehow sucked into an industrial machine. Co-workers tried to remove him, but didn't have the proper resources to do so. It isn't clear how exactly the employee was in this jam, but I would assume something he wore got tangled up with the component of the machine while it was operating and pulled him in. Either the machine power supply was shut off by a witness or it stopped because his body jammed it, but either way, he was stuck and contorted and bent backward to the point the heel of his feet was nearly a foot away from his face. In this horrible position, this would cause shallow breathing, possible fractures in the ribs, long-term damage to the spine, and possible internal bleeding. Paramedics and firefighters were called, and when they arrived, they hooked him up to an IV drip to alleviate some of the excruciating pain. Pain he is clearly expressing in these images. As you see in this photo, there is a woman here close to the victim, keeping him calm and trying to comfort him, and every minute must have felt like slow days of absolute agony. When firefighters arrived to help this poor man, it took them 15 more minutes to dismantle the machine and finally free him. He was rushed to a hospital and into immediate surgery. Although it was reported that he was rescued, there aren't any updates on his current condition. On February 9, 2019, a Michigan man by the name of Daniel Hill was at work performing his daily duties as usual at MST, Michigan Seamless Tube and Pipe. MST has been the leading manufacturer of carbon and alloy seamless cold-drawn pipes and tubes for over 80 years. Around early afternoon, a little past 12 p.m., Daniel was assigned to check the chemicals in the tank.
Sulfuric acid is a mineral acid composed of the elements sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen, with the molecular formula H2SO4. It is a colorless, odorless, and viscous liquid that is miscible with water.
Daniel was testing the solution inside the vat to make sure it was 10 to 12% sulfuric acid. Now what happened next is something you wouldn't wish on your sworn enemy. He lost his balance, slipped, and fell in the vat of acid. Completely submerged, he tried desperately to get out. Now other nearby co-workers who turned around and see what was happening ran as fast as they could to try to remove Daniel out the tank. Once he was removed, they immediately took him to a designated decontamination area. So the co-workers were trying to dilute the corrosive chemicals and wash it off of him, and the co-workers themselves burned their arms and hands, also suffered 160-degree chemical burns. At around 12:30, paramedics were called, EMT was on the way, while the co-workers were trying to aid Daniel. Fire Chief Robert Vogel stated he was completely submerged and was 100% covered in burns. Daniel was trying to get out. They ran and grabbed him and pulled him out. When we arrived, he was walking and talking. It was pretty extreme burns. Once the paramedics got him, they rushed him to the University of Michigan Hospital in Ann Arbor. His entire body endured way too much trauma, and despite all their efforts, he succumbed to his injuries. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, conducted an inspection which revealed 63 violations for improper procedures for employee entry into permit-required confined spaces. The employer did not ensure an employee was wearing chemical-resistant goggles or face shield when handling sulfuric acid. The department stated in an email, emergency showers were not immediately available at the location where employees retrieved and handled samples of sulfuric acid. Michigan Seamless Tube was fined $32,500. A Michigan Seamless spokesman described Daniel as a valued employee. Daniel Hill is survived by a wife, 2 daughters, and 2 grandchildren.
To the Army veteran, Daniel Hill, thank you for your service.
Many years ago, when I was 14 years old, I went trick-or-treating with a couple of my friends. Some of my friends had pillowcases and I had a big bucket. I don't mean a pumpkin-designed bucket, I'm talking about a paint bucket. I was a big, chubby 14-year-old with an insatiable appetite. If I could, I'd get candy from the whole city. So my friends and I went house to house, even bumping into a few of our friends, trading candies and whatnot. There's a few knuckleheads around that was throwing eggs, and to be honest, it looked kind of fun, so I joined them, hitting cars and running away as soon as the car stopped, jumping fences and acting like an absolute fool. And when the coast was clear, we proceeded to trick-or-treat. It was getting late, and some of my friends had a curfew. I mean, I did as well, but my mom was a little bit more lenient. So they started to head back to the neighborhood, and eventually we parted ways. I wanted more candy, so I headed to a direction I wasn't too familiar with. In this area, there weren't really many trick-or-treaters. Actually, there were only like 1 or 2. Now, in this neighborhood, maybe 1 out of 8 houses, somebody would treat me to some candy, but the other houses, they wouldn't even answer the door. So I continued on down the street to achieve my goal of filling up this bucket. So I continued trick-or-treating, knowing well that the night is over. But if I could squeeze out some more Snickers and Twix, maybe some Starbursts, well, why not, I thought. So after a few more streets, I decided, I think the night is over. Time to go home. Turned around, started walking towards my neighborhood. At this point, I'm about a mile, maybe a mile and a half from home. The bucket is half full and getting smaller by the minute because I'm eating on the way back, leaving a trail of wrappers behind me. While walking down these unfamiliar streets, I came across this one house that had this very spooky decoration in the front, and I thought, wow, they really put a lot of time in this. I even stopped walking and just stared at the house. It was pretty dark outside, and I could see two figures standing right there in front of the door. It looked like they were wearing a hoodie or some kind of cloak. After about 20 seconds of staring at it, I just decided to continue walking. It was then I heard a couple of footsteps rustling through the grass and dead leaves. I instantly turned around and see the figures moving towards me, but this time, their faces lit up with a skeleton. That scared the heck out of me, but I was relieved. Thinking it was some kind of Halloween jump scare prank, I laughed. I told them, "Alright guys, you got me. Happy Halloween," and I continued walking. Now mind you, there weren't any streetlights. The road was poorly lit with some of the neighbors' Halloween decorations. So I continued walking, trying to calm my heart down because I just got the crap scared out of me. There were no more trick-or-treaters in the street. While walking, I continued unwrapping candy, and again, I heard footsteps. The same two figures behind me. This time, their skeleton masks were turned off. Now I'm thinking, maybe this prank is going on a little too far. I just started walking faster. And when I walked faster, the steps behind me got faster. It was then I started getting nervous. My fear compelled me to look back, and sure enough, they were walking behind me. They were about a good 30 feet away, but every time I looked back, they would get a little closer. I started to think, well, maybe they just want my candy. So I turned around and said, "Hey guys, you guys want some candy or something?" And without a word, they just started running towards me. I was a little chubby, but I played football, and I was very used to running. And that's exactly what I did. After I ran one block, I realized I was still holding a bucket of candy. So I dropped it, thinking if I let go dead weight, I could run faster, and those two attackers behind me would get what they want. A moment later, I looked back. These two attackers ran right past the bucket of candy and started gaining on me. I decided to cut through some houses and jump some fences. I jumped one fence, and when I landed, it felt like I sprained my right ankle, but my adrenaline would not let me stop, so I continued running. Went down a block, cut another street, cut in between some other houses, and didn't hear any steps behind me, but I kept running. I saw a couple of people standing in front of their house, so I yelled for help. I don't know if they thought it was a prank or they were just flat out terrified, but they both ran inside and locked the door. I ran to the door and knocked and begged them for help. That's when I heard some rustling noise nearby. I stayed quiet. Then I crawled towards the car in the driveway, face to face with a bumper, and staring out to the side, seeing these two figures walking around, looking every direction. I'm trying to breathe calmly so they don't hear me. One raised his hand and pointed towards the end of the street, signaling the other to go that direction. This was my opportunity to go the opposite direction and escape. Just as I'm bear crawling away from the driveway, a light turns on. The front entrance of the house lights up. The front door opens, and a girl comes yelling out, "That's him! That's him, Dad!" This huge guy with a bat comes out, yelling at me. I tried to explain the best I could. No, you don't understand. These guys are trying to attack me. I need help. His body language let me know he was not trying to hear it. He held his bat out and asked me, do I want to go to the hospital? I said, "Sir, I'm sorry. It's a misunderstanding." He said, "You better get out of here, punk." With both my hands up in the air, I said, "Okay, I'm sorry." He told his daughters to get back inside. And through all that commotion, I looked to my right, and now I see the two attackers running back towards me. I'm running for my life again. This time I'm in an area where the streetlights are on, so hiding isn't going to be as easy. When I look back, one of the attackers had a machete. I never ran so fast in my life. I came across a street where I see a car running about 40 miles per hour. I jump in front so the driver can stop and possibly help me, and he just drove around me and hit the gas. I continued running. Now, usually I know I wouldn't run this long for no reason, but the will to survive will give you a boost. There was one corner I cut when I see a long row of cars parked in the street. I ran past a few of them and I jumped underneath one of them. It was like an old minivan or something. I stayed quiet, well, as quiet as I could, because I was breathing very, very hard. I can feel my body tremble with every heartbeat. A short moment later, The two attackers ran up on the same street. I was praying they just continued running, but they just stopped and looked around. Now, some of you may think, well, why didn't you just use your cell phone? I didn't have a cell phone. At that time, those were used by lawyers and business owners. We still had landlines. The only possible help returned with a bat with bad intentions. I was on my own. Screwed. One of the guys chasing me was telling the other, I know he's around here somewhere. He couldn't have gotten that far, while the other guy's machete was grazing the concrete. And no, this machete was not a Halloween toy. It was the real deal. Terrified is an understatement. I was ready to pass out. I'm in an unfamiliar place, under a minivan, getting chased by guys with machetes. I don't know what the hell these people wanted from me, but I wasn't asking, so I stayed quiet. They split up and continued looking for me. I was underneath the car for about 10 minutes, but it felt like a day. Less than a block away, a white car pulled up, and both those guys jumped in and left. I waited for about 2 minutes, and that's when I crawled out from underneath the minivan. That's when I heard an engine revving, getting closer and closer. I jumped back underneath the minivan, and that same white sedan started driving towards my direction. And it slowed down. It stopped. It continued slowly driving until they reached the stop sign. They made a right, and then they peeled off. I didn't get out from underneath the van right away because clearly they were still searching, so I stayed under there. I waited for about 2 hours, wet and uncomfortable, terrified. While I was underneath the van, I seen a couple of people walk by, some people riding bikes, some even jumped in the cars that were in that row of parked vehicles and drove off. So after about 2 hours, I slowly poked my head out and pulled myself out. Now in my neighborhood, there's this huge tower that you can see from several miles away. So because I was lost, I had to look for it. That was pretty much my GPS back home. After walking around some houses, I found it. And again, I was consumed with fear and frustration once I realized the whole time I was running the opposite direction of my neighborhood. This time I was about roughly 2 miles away. I made my way back home. During my trip, I seen a white car pulling up slowly, so I ducked behind some cars. I bear crawled behind some trees and watched the car slowly drive. It was an old lady. I'm realizing now that I'm very paranoid, but I'm not taking any chances. I proceeded to walk. I saw a newer model, well-lit house. I walked up to the door and knocked, and a young couple answered. I begged them to please call the police so I could make my way home. They did just that. About 15 minutes later, police came, and I explained everything. They took down the description of the attackers, the white car, and the neighborhood they chased me out of. I thanked the young couple and jumped in the police car. They gave me a ride back home, where they had to inform my mom of what happened. My mom was hysterical, crying her eyes out. At this time, it was about 10:30. My father was informed of what happened later. He worked the overnight shift. I went inside and threw the dirty clothes in a hamper. My clothes were filled with dirt and dried up dead leaves. I took a shower and I realized I had a bunch of cuts and bruises, even a little bit of road rash. My arms were filled with ant bites. After the shower, my mom and I stayed in the living room. She tells me in a stern voice,
"You won't be staying out past 8 o'clock."
I replied, "Yes, Mom." My mom didn't sleep all night. Every time I woke up, my mom was right there at the end of the couch. I dozed off on the couch, woke up momentarily just to doze off again. Then I was awoken by my father. He gave me a big hug and asked me if I'm okay. He said he'll be making a trip to the police department to get an update of the situation and to see if they got the suspects yet. But I know my father very well. He wanted to grab his weapon and look for them. That morning, my mom told me to stay home. She called the school to inform them of the incident. My mom also called my childhood friend's parents to spread the warning of the dangers in the neighborhood. Later that day in the afternoon, my friends came over to visit. They were in shock, but a few of them tried to make light of the situation, teasing me by saying, "Well, hey, that's what you get for being greedy." They were just happy to see me alive. We were all in the living room joking around. Then we all suddenly stopped talking once we heard the name of our community on the TV. A homicide in Ventura Lakes. When we all looked at the TV, we saw one of our classmates, Chris Rivera, found dead earlier that afternoon. He was brutally murdered. I instantly became nauseated, dizzy. and caught a horrible anxiety attack. I guess this was my first bout with PTSD. My mom started to cry again. I took a couple of deep breaths. I got up and gave her a hug. How can somebody be so cruel, so disgusting, so evil? I would never understand. The look on all my friends' faces were just lost, pale. This tragic incident occurred about 25 years ago, and the monsters responsible have yet to be caught.
Thank you for watching. Disturbed is the word. Please be safe.